Welcome everyone, thanks a lot for coming. It means a lot to me to see colleagues and students from the two masters. So very happy to be here to present the book. So the way we're gonna do it is I'm gonna talk like 15 minutes, 20 minutes presenting some of the key ideas of the book. It's not gonna be a PowerPoint or anything. So I'm gonna read a few, I'm gonna read a few excerpts from the book, and I'm gonna say a few of the core ideas and what I wanted to do with this book. And then I invited Vicky to share her thoughts on the book. So it's pretty free-flowing what she's going to talk about. But it's like what she found in it, what she found interesting, questions, critiques, everything is welcome. Joanna, fortunately, won't be able to make it, Joan Martinez-Allier. But let me say, my idea of inviting Vicky, who is not someone who works on degrowth or on ecological economics, my idea from the beginning was that this book, I didn't write it just for my audience. So it's not written just for people who understand ecological economics. It's not written for people who understand what degrowth is about. Someone asked me, why don't you mention degrowth not even once in the book? And I said it was on purpose because I wanted to speak to a broader audience and make a broader argument than the one I make normally. I have a few copies of the book. It's not self-promotion, but I paid for some extra copies of the book in case anyone wants to buy it. So if you want to buy it, it's here. If you don't have it, then it's 11 euros. So if anyone wants after, I'm happy to give you a copy. And there are 2 copies circulating to get an idea of what the book looks like. What else did I want to say? Yes, you are all welcome to ask questions after we finish. So I think we'll see. Either I respond to Vicky's comments or we open it, and then I respond to everyone. And you are welcome to make comments without reading the book, based on what you hear here, which is tricky. So don't criticize me. No, that's not correct if you haven't read the book, but you can tell me, okay, from what you said, I'm not convinced yet, okay? So that's fine. This book started as a project that I wanted to write something on ecological economics and political ecology. So it started from a small paper that then exploded into a big book that I said, okay, if I want to write on ecological economics and political ecology, I have to touch on all these issues that they are cross-cutting, like social metabolism, limits, etc. And then I started writing about limits, and then this thing that I was trying to write was going to be the section of a paper, then became a whole book on its own, and then became unmanageable. And what is in this book is like the first 3 chapters of this bigger, huge book that was going to be on limits, where I didn't know what I was doing exactly, but I knew that I wanted to explore a tension that I had, and a tension I was feeling exists between ecological economics and political ecology, but which has also a political mirror. And let's say it's a tension that exists between environmentalists and Greens and progressivists, we might call them like progressive left, or a tension around limits. I think that it's captured around also the theoretical debate that there is between ecological economics and political ecology. And let me say what I mean by that. I mean, in ecological economics, we tend to think of limits as an environment. We very often have this diagram where it's society, there is economy, there is society, and then there is an ecosystem that is putting planetary boundaries on the economy. So limits is something very hard, something you cannot negotiate, and that comes from the outside. And for me, as a PhD student, this resonated with my idea of the environment. The environment is something out there that puts limits to us we have to respect. We are doing something, but it should be with respect of this bigger sphere, etc. But then when I learned political ecology, which is, as some of you know who have been my students in political ecology, it's much more critical of this idea of the environment as being something out of us, limits as being something given and fixed in nature. And then I learned a lot of critical Marxist political ecology, which was questioning how this idea of limits as being something natural has been used over and over to oppress people. A lot of literature that you might know that limits for conservation that have been used to oppress marginalized groups. Limits around population that they have been used in anti-immigrant discourses. No? So there are these 2 tensions between the notion of limits that I wanted to work theoretically in my head, and I wanted to put in words in this book. And through my studies and my PhD and my postdoc, the person who has more influenced me, and I thank in the book, is Richard Norgaard, who is an ecological economist with whom I worked. I did my postdoc in Berkeley. And he had this theory of coevolution, where this relationship between humans and nature, society and environment, is much more fluid, is much more dialectical, is much more reciprocal and mutual. And this was always a framework that I found useful for me to start thinking around this notion of limits. Norgaard was someone who, although he was an ecological economist and one of the most important ecological economists, he was also critical of the idea of limits. He was both critical of the idea that thermodynamics put absolute limits to economic activity, and he was also very critical of the idea that there are some scientists that can tell us which is the absolute limit of what we can use or how much we can do something, and then we listen to them. He said this is also politically tricky. And there was a paper he wrote that he was called in ecological economics that I suggest for you, those of you who are interested in ecological economics, to read, which was called Metaphors We Might Survive By. Metaphors we might survive by. And then Norgaard looked at different metaphors and at their potential and at their problems. And one of the metaphors he looked was limits. He discarded the idea of limits as something out there, and then he had this phrase, which I think is the starting part of my book. He said, if limits are to be our primary metaphor, let it take the meaning of limiting our negative impacts on each other and the environments with which we interact. So here he makes this shift from limits as being something out there, that it's coming to us from the sky, from the environment, from something outside of us. And he says, if this is our guiding metaphor as environmentalists, let it think of us as limits that we put upon ourselves. And this is the core idea that I'm trying to develop in this book. I make a distinction between two ways of thinking about limits, and they are both present in environmentalism. Both are very strong, and both are ideas of limits that we, environmentalists or environmental scientists, mobilize. One, it's limits as something out there, our planetary boundaries, limits by nature or by our own nature, the limits of our bodies. And then there is the idea of self-limitation, which is the value of living a life within limits as being the good life, a life that leaves space for human and non-human others. These ideas I argue in this book are mixed very often, but they are not the same. And there are important differences between them. And the idea to capture that in the history of the ideas is to put one of these ideas very close to Malthus and the other idea of self-limitation to the Romantics, which was a movement of literature. And actually, they were one of the strongest critics of Malthus and his work at the time. So I speak a little bit in the book about Malthus and the Romantics, because I think the environmentalism that I like, the environmentalism of self-limitation, is an environmentalism that comes to the environmental movement as a legacy of the Romantics and the Romantic movement. You will hear it sometimes as derogatory. You are romantics, no? But romantics in a nice way, I think, here. So this is how I start my book. This is one paragraph that I have at the beginning of my book in the preface, and I think captures a little bit the overall argument. So I say, born in 1972, the same year that the Limits to Growth report was published, I find that the debate between supposed optimists and supposed pessimists has been exhausted. These opposing views are but two sides of the same coin. Without limits, capitalism's quest for endless growth does not make sense. Malthus and other early priests of capitalism constructed a picture whereby unlimited human wants clash with a limited world. Scarcity and growth became an inseparable pair, with limits sparing efforts for growth. My thesis is that it is only when we begin to accept the world as abundant that we can contemplate limiting our wants and delimiting a safe space for our freedom. This notion may appear counterintuitive, but that's because we tend to think of limits in the Malthusian terms of scarcity. This book develops a different view of limits, one of limits as self-limitation, a view that I will trace from radical Greens back to the Romantics and even further back to the classics and the ancients. And that's maybe because I'm Greek and I like to read about ancient Greece. You know, how this chauvinism in Greece. You're gonna forgive it to me. So I start the book with an example where I'm trying to capture, so this book I enjoyed a lot, by the way, because I didn't do just ecological economics. I mixed it with a lot of literature, science fiction. And actually my biggest success of this book is that Kim Stanley Robinson, who is a famous science fiction writer, just sent me an email saying, I loved your book, and he sent me his next book that I can read before it's published. So for me, it's like mission accomplished. Of my book, I don't think so, but okay. There are also some personal things that I don't want to see in the movie. Like, I have a weird story here of me going with a bicycles with my friends, so that's too personal. But I start the book with a extract from a movie, and this is thanks to Giacomo, who is sitting there back there, and he told me, you want to think about limits, watch this movie, The Legend of 1900, which is about a pianist who stays all his life in a boat. So they find him abandoned baby in a boat, and he's 1900 because he's born, they find him the first day of the year of the previous millennium. So they find him there, he grows up in the boat, he never leaves the boat, and then he becomes like a very good pianist player. So he becomes notorious all over the world. People come inside to duel with him, he beats them all, then comes someone to tell him, I have to get you out in New Orleans to write an album, to record an album. He decides to go out of the boat. He's halfway through the boat, then looks back and then says, no, I'm staying in, that this city is too much for me, I cannot get that, I cannot handle this city, it's too big, And then after years, he's still in the boat is going to be scuttled, it's going to be sunk, and a friend knows that probably he's still hiding in the boat, goes down there to pick him out, says like, please come out, don't stay here. And he tells me I can't go out because he says like, I don't want to go out. He says, because when I went to go out, the city seemed infinite to me, The boat is my limit, and within this limit I can function. He says, and then he makes a metaphor with the piano. He says, give me an infinite piano, I can play any music. You give me a piano that has a limit, and then I do create infinite music. So that's thanks to Giacomo, who pointed that to me. But it was very useful for me to start the book with this image, because this image captures a little bit the sense of what I want to say about self-limitation. So what I want to do with the book, it might take me longer than I thought, It might take me 20 minutes. If someone can do like this when we reach at 35, you can do like this, and then I will speed it up. I say that at the beginning of the book, I want to make environmentalists also think more about how they talk about limits and how they understand limits. And I'm saying that the Malthusian way of talking about limits, this course that we often reproduce, which is like there are planetary boundaries, we are running out of oil, the world is ending, I'm arguing that this is counterproductive if put in these terms, these Malthusian terms. And I start the book by going back to what Malthus, in his essay, the famous essay on population, argued, the essay that we tend to take in ecological economics and economics in general as the first book that put this idea of limits on the agenda, And we normally tend to think about limits of Malthus as someone who was worried about overpopulation, resource scarcity, and that he predicted famines, etc. And I went and read it again, not because I'm clever and I said I'm going to find something different, but because I read biographers of Malthus who were saying Malthus said something very different, and because I read someone who said actually Malthus was not someone who was advocating limits, was someone who was advocating growth. So I said, okay, that sounds interesting. Let's go and look again what Malthus has to say. So I start the book by clarifying a little bit more what was it that Malthus said. And I'm saying that what Malthus said is a courtesy to us, it's still with us thanks to an ingrained thinking of our civilization, but I think more distilled into the science of economics, and through that also to ecological economics or environmentalism. So I'm arguing that Malthus, and that's a historical fact, was not an advocate of population control. He was actually against birth control, and he wrote that very clearly in his book. He actually didn't believe that there was resource scarcity. He said there are as many resources as we want, as long as we want them, they're going to be appearing, like a very, you would call it economistic argument today, but that was what Malthus was saying. And on the contrary, he was saying that what we have to do is like grow agricultural production or food production as much as we can to satisfy the potential of the population to grow exponentially. So rather than predicting that if the population grows exponentially, something terrible is going to happen, what Malthus was arguing is that population is bound to expand exponentially, it's bound to crash, and it's bound to create problems. And the best we can do is try to produce as much as possible to satisfy this limit. So what I'm arguing here is that Malthus was one of the first to put this idea of limits and growth, or limits and limitless growth, one next to the other, one as the antidote of the others, the two sides of the same coin, as I say, to our days and to the 1970s. So like I'm reading about my book, the paragraph I conclude about Malthus. I say Malthus, I conclude, was why he was wrong. So I'm saying he was not wrong for the reasons people normally say he was wrong. So Malthus was wrong not because he underestimated technology and growth, which he did not. Malthus was not wrong because he did not see that we could limit our numbers. He saw it, but he deemed it unnatural, immoral, and miserable. He saw it actually as ungodly. He said, if you try to have birth control, you are going against the wish of God, which is to multiply and populate the earth. And if you don't do that, then you won't have stimulus to work hard and produce even more. So he was against birth control because he thought it was against the wish of God, or the way he understood God. He was actually advocating growth in the name of population, and I argue that he was much more like a modern economist. Malthus was wrong because he did not want to entertain the idea that we could limit our numbers and be happy, that we can have sex, have fun, and enjoy life without having scores of children and without being immoral or unnatural while doing so. Malthus could not imagine a future where women have free sexual relations without having children, without being prostitutes, and this is not me saying stupidities here, but he says the only way of not having children is to be a prostitute, and that's a vice, etc., in the book, you know. Without being secretive and without anyone suffering as a result. Crucially, he did not want to see this because if he did, then he would have to admit that there might be enough for everyone to have a decent share. So what I'm saying here is that he was denying limits because precisely what he was trying to argue constantly was that there isn't enough for everyone, and that's why we need to have a society of rich and poor people. If there was enough for everyone, then you would need to have this class society. This dialectic of limits and limitless growth has been with us ever since. So what I'm doing next in the book, I'm looking a little bit at the history of economics very briefly, and I'm focusing on the essay by Robbins, which is, what's the name? It's considered the definition of economic science, when he defines as economics as the study of scarcity, more or less. And then Robinson. And Robinson has there a very funny story. No, Robbins. Check it. I think it's Robbins. The method of, yeah. But Robbins has a story of Robinson there, which is what I find funny. So he has the story of Robinson Crusoe. And he has this, which I think is very illustrative of the understanding of scarcity in economics, and I'm saying it's coming from Malthus, where he says, imagine in a Robinson Crusoe, he was in an island, you know? He had all time to do whatever he wanted. He was free, he had enough food, he had his parrot, he had his servant, he had everything, right? But then he said he still faced scarcity. Why? Because he didn't know, should I read a book now or should I go swimming? Should I go talk to the parrot or should I go hunting? Should I prepare for the next? So Robbins is arguing there that scarcity is a fundamental condition of the human condition. We won't escape it never. Because we want so many things, we want potentially to do an infinite amount of things, that we can never have enough to satisfy that. I'm arguing that this is very similar, although it's underestimated how similar it is, to Malthus' argument that potentially we want to have an infinite amount of kids, a progressive growth of the population, and we don't have enough to satisfy that. So what I'm writing in the book is this story of scarcity, like Malthus, is circular or tautological. It begins with an assumption that what people want to do or have has no limits. From this, it derives scarcity, which justifies growth, which in turn validates people's wanting and pursuing things without limit. In reality, growth is a particular need of capitalism, a system that requires a compounding of profits. With the invention of scarcity, though, growth was naturalized and sacralized. It was inscribed in human nature. Growth is what people, not economists or the owners of capital, want. And the origins of this assumption are sacred, be it God's wish for Christians, like in Malthus, who said God wants us to multiply and populate, or the birthright of people to pursue whatever it is they want, for liberals. The underlying assumption here is the same. People want as much as possible, and the conclusion is, so they should. Environmentalists, I'm arguing, have to escape these terms of the debate that have passed through us through the ages. We need to create a structure through which there is space for wanting limits, for being Robinson Crusoe and saying, I don't want to do any of that stuff, you know? I can just live by the island and enjoy my life. And I'm arguing that this spirit is very present in the Romantics, in the work of the Romantics. I'm going to go back to that. But what do I mean when I say that there are no limits? Because this is an argument that I have had I have a big trouble communicating to environmentalists like me or environmental scientists. So when they hear this argument, they're saying, oops, you've turned too much of a sociologist, of a social constructivist. Are you telling us that there are no planetary boundaries? Are you telling us that there are no physical reality outside of us? Obviously, there is as much soil under the soil and as much carbon dioxide that we can emit without having serious impacts. But these, I argue, are not limits in the abstract, as the law of gravity is not a limit. So the law of gravity just is a physical reality. You know, the law of gravity is a limit if you imagine that you can jump from a skyscraper and land on your feet. Then it's a limit. But if you want to go deep in the sea and scuba dive, the law of gravity is on your favor. So what I'm arguing is that the planetary conditions on their own are not a limit. They are a limit only in relation to what we want to do. So it always, at the last instance, it rests on our intention, the limit. The limit does not come to us from the outside. It's relational, of course, but it rests eventually with our intention. You see that I'm getting very philosophical here. So I've had a lot of problems communicating that. One of my best interlocutors and more difficult ones is Eric Gomez, that some of you know. I'll never convince Eric on that. He's a biologist. We had a trip after I presented that at Cambridge. We were together in the train. I was talking 2 hours to him. Yeah, but no. And he's still there. He's not convinced. So I have a part in my book that I respond to Eric without saying that it's Eric, you know, because he was telling me, what do you mean? There isn't a limit when we contaminate water. So you want to tell us that we can contaminate as much as we want water without being an actual limit in the lake and how much it can be contaminated? And I'm saying, I insist that there are no external limits, but not in the sense that climate change is not real or that we can emit as much carbon as we like, but that the limit resides in our intention to live a life fueled by carbon, and it is the intention that we should limit. Water contamination, Eric, is a limit if we want a clean public supply available to all. It is not a limit if we are fine with a world where everyone has to buy expensive bottled water because rivers are contaminated. If we want to have clean public water, then we must put a limit on contamination. But this limit is a matter of choice, determined by the type of world we want to create and pass to our children. We do not gain anything by ascribing this choice to nature. So I have a problem with the idea that in order to think about limits, we have to ascribe this limit to some planetary boundaries. And I'm arguing that it's much better to think in terms of we are screwing the planet, we are doing damage to the planet, and we should limit ourselves, keeping always the attention and the ball that it's on us. It's not on something that is coming external to us. I explain in the book why I find this vision of the limit as something being external is very problematic. Because time and again it can be used exactly for the response, which is then we should overcome the limit, then we should fly to the moon, then we should go to Mars, which is what Jeff Bezos wants to do now and Elon Musk. That's the normal reaction when we put the limit outside of us. I'm saying that the only way we can ever respect planetary boundaries is if we accept that it is we ourselves that we want to bound ourselves within said planetary boundaries. Malthus' frame, I argue in the book, I write in the book, is so ingrained in our minds that it seems paradoxical that we would limit ourselves if nature were bountiful. Because one of the other arguments I make is that only if we accept that the planet is actually abundant, we are going to limit ourselves. Which is very paradoxical if you think about it. The way we've been trained, only if there are limits, we're going to limit ourselves. So you say, what if it's abundant, we're just going to spoil it, right? If we say that there is no scarcity. So I'm saying Malthus' frame is so ingrained in our minds that it seems paradoxical that we would limit ourselves if nature were bountiful. Shouldn't we see that nature is scarce so as to conserve it? No, say the Romantics. Again, the Romantics here. Because nature is scarce only if there are excessive wants. The innate response to scarcity is then relentless conquest and subjugation. Nature becomes abundant when we enjoy what it has to offer, limiting our wants. And the Romantics captured this intuitively and poetically. So they said, only if you start seeing the earth as abundant, you're going to say, I have enough, you know. I don't need more and more and more, like Robinson Crusoe. And another inspiration I found for this argument is the people who have studied hunter-gatherers. And they have shown how for hunter-gatherers that they live in much poorer conditions than we do. They trust the environment. Their environment is scarce for our point of view, no? But they trust that the environment is what it is and it's going to provide for them every year. And because of that, they don't get into the business of accumulating, logging more the forest, expanding the forest, bringing things from the outside. They live with what they have. So I'm saying the paradoxical view there is that it is us who think in terms of scarcity that keep expanding and destroying the environment, and it's they who think in terms of abundance that stay within their limits. Too much information? No? Okay, sorry for that. Okay, this is the first half of the book. Second half of the book, I go a little bit deeper into the question of limits, and this is something I wasn't planning to do, but I did. After I get into it, I said, okay, I can't leave it here. I have to think carefully more about limits. And here, I think I enjoy it more because I write about the Greeks, I write about fiction, and I write about science fiction. So this is something I say about the Greeks, and this is the idea of hubris that I find very interesting from the Greeks. Hubris, Castoriadis writes, was a transgression of previously undefined limits. It was not about disobeying a limit already set by the gods, but about excess, taking too much of something and removing it from its representative gods. Hubris means that limits, boundaries cannot be set in advance. That's why phronesis, cautiousness, moderation is required. The boundaries do exist. And when we will have crossed them, it will be too late, by definition. But the heroes of ancient tragedy only learn that they are inhabited by hubris, by excess, once the catastrophe has taken place. That's a very change of our idea that we really need to know where the boundary is in order to respect it. For the Greeks, it was the opposite. You can never know the boundary, but once you cross it, then you're going to know it. So hubris was not like, oh, I know that if I do that, I might be punished by the gods. No, it was like, I don't know if the gods going to like it or not, but it seems to me it's excessive, so probably the gods are going to get angry because I'm taking too much out of them. So it was a premise of moderation, of self-limitation built in the civilization. And it was built in the tragedy, built in the institution of democracy, built in many different ways that I list in my book. Interestingly, why were the Greeks obsessed with limits? Richard Seaford, who I brought here last year to talk about it, he argues because they were the first civilization to use general purpose money. And they got terrified by the prospect of what they saw money can do to society and to inequality, to compound without limit. So their whole civilization, the democracy, the tragedy, the philosophy was developed as a response to this fear of this infiniteness and limitlessness of money, which I think is also what we are encountering nowadays. One big topic I touch is death and limits through the ancient Greeks. And I'm saying death, of course, is the ultimate limit. And it's not far-fetched to think that the human fear of limits has to do with the fear of dying. Unlike religious societies, the Greeks did not try to beautify or exorcise the abyss of death. For the Greeks, Castoriadis writes, the fundamental thing is mortality. The mortals are the humans. That is what being human is. Like many people today, the Greeks did not believe in the myth of a happy afterlife. In Hades, the otherworld of the dead, even heroes were reduced to miserable shadows. But having accepted the ultimate limit of death, and having thus been liberated from the desire to transgress a limit that cannot be transgressed, the Greeks were able to accept that it is we, or they, who make meaning in our lives. Unable to deal with an unthinkable limit in our civilization, how hard it is for us to deal with death, right? We don't want to think about it, and when it happens, we want to bury it and go away. Unable to deal with an unthinkable limit, our civilization's only response is to think it does not exist until it does. It is no coincidence then that in our supposedly disenchanted world, we still fantasize about immortality, as our obsession with health and the occultation of death reveal, no? Our whole obsession is like, how can we live longer? How can we exercise more? For the Greeks, that was like repulsive, you know? To exercise in order to live longer, we're like, you're gonna die when you die, you know? You're exercising for very different reasons. This fantasy of transgressing this limit of death has been transferred into the idea of indefinite progress and indefinite growth. I would say this is our obsession writ large at the level of civilization. Our irrational taboo against suicide comes then as no surprise, whereas in the ancient world, suicide could sometimes be honorable. Or consider the standard Hollywood plot in which the hero faces a series of threats to life only to overcome them and live happily ever after. Incapable of finding meaning, because once the gods are gone, there is no meaning, our culture has displaced the search for meaning into a struggle for life against death as a meaning unto itself. And if you think the tragedy, there was always hubris, and then there was like a justice coming. In our tragedies, in our movies, it's always the fear of death, and it's a hero who beats it and overcomes it. I mean, 90% of the plots have this thing, and when they don't have it, it didn't have a happy end, you know? My God, there is death in life, you know? We have to deal with it. Now, we shouldn't be, I don't want to be too absolute with limits. Okay, this is like last 5 minutes. I'm arguing that adventure and transgression is also necessary. And adventure begins when limits are crossed. But temporary transgression, I argue, of a fixed frontier is not the same as capitalism's imaginary of the permanent transgression of a constantly expanding frontier. An adventure that is constant, crossing the limits constantly, is no adventure. Odysseus needs an Ithaca. His adventure would be pointless if he had to fight Cyclops and Sirens for the rest of his life. That's a joke. Imagine if imagine if the whole book was like him adventure after adventure, you know? What would be the meaning of that? He had to have Ithaca at the end to return to his limit, right? What would be the point? It is a temporary transgression in limit experiences, experience at the limit, experiences that presuppose the presence of limit that brings joy. Dionysian outbursts and feasts make sense if your normal life is sober. The dream of a constant Dionysian delirium, a hidden desire that fuels our civilization. Now, our dream, or at least my dream when I was a little bit younger, was, could I live in a constant party all the time, you know? It's not only self-destructive, because in order to do that, I would need to take a lot of drugs that I never did. I'm a coward, so I couldn't do that now. But the point is not just that it's self-destructive. It's not fun. It's not there that it's the meaning, you know. But that's the meaning that our civilization rests upon. And in the book, I discuss a movie that I found super illustrative for that, which is a movie called Limitless. It's not an accident that it's called that. And it's basically a hero who takes a drug, and he becomes very powerful, and at the end, he arrives even to become a president of the US. And I'm surprised that the movie ends there. So he's not punished. I was like, what? Is it because I'm Greek that I expected hubris? No, it's because this movie was made 2 years ago, and it's for the audience of Trump and for people who precisely that's what they see, you know, like a constant effort to expand over bodies and at all costs.
So Trump is taking drugs? Oh.
Yeah.
I guess so, I don't know. No, maybe, no, actually he doesn't drink Trump. Okay, he throws me off on this one. So I'm arguing, though, self-limitation doesn't mean that you just constrain yourself and you become a miser, you know, because that's also what appalls us to, the idea of self-limitation or moderation. So, and that's with this I'm gonna finish, which is, what does it mean to live a life within limits? I say the archetype of self-limitation is not a miser who counts how much he has spent and saved, but a Mediterranean woman or man, this is my bias, okay, because I'm Greek, who having liberated desire, sorry, Jeroen, that's man and woman too potentially. It's not, I don't mean it geographically, but I mean it as an archetype of a different type of interaction with the limits of life. I say a Mediterranean woman or man who having liberated desire and embraced contradiction leads a sober life punctuated by wasteful outbursts. Nikos Kazantzakis' fictional hero, Alexis Zorbas, widely known as Zorba the Greek, probably you've eaten in a taverna with this name, comes to mind here as an unlikely model of moderation with his excessive outbursts of laughter and dance and his contradictory character. Sobriety and a simple life coupled with outbursts of uncalculated giving and spending. Moderation, I argue, does not have to mean the negation of life and the suppression of desire in expectation of a future return, a Protestant ethic that is at the heart of accumulation and expansion. It can be a practice of reflecting on, mastering, and living with our contradictions, as we learned from the Greeks and as the psychoanalysts remind us. So the basic argument of this book is that I want to reinstate the search for limits, the consideration of limits, our own search of self-limitation as the premise of thinking about society. And I want to argue that this is what environmentalists do at their best. This is what is the most commendable thing in environmentalism, that it's the only social movement that keeps this idea alive against even socialist progressives that, you know, they want to expand, they want to mind the comments. They want to go further and further. And I say, what's valuable with environmentalists is that we've tried to keep this wisdom that comes through also religion, spiritual values. We've tried to keep it alive. And I would like us to not have to recourse to the argument that it's the planet that is asking us to do that, and take responsibility for our actions and say that it is we ourselves that want to do that. That's it.
Okay, so, well, let me start by thanking Yorgos for actually inviting me to read the book. For those of you who don't know me, I am a cultural anthropologist. I work more with indigenous people and how people relate to nature, not an economist at all, although there are many things I have learned from ecological economics in this house. And I want to start first with an anecdote of my first contact with the book, and then I'll just give my impressions on reading the books. I just want to say that Yorgos invited me to read the book and be here today sharing my thoughts. And I had the book at home, and I have like these teenagers, very ecologically radical, kind of like Greta Thunberg at home. And then my daughter, who has read all the degrowth, she's 16, all the degrowth books, and her aspiration in life is to study degrowth adicta. That's her goal in life. She read the book, and she said, oh, no, yeah, I like it. And then once I say, I have to, they actually, in one of my travels, I say, I have to go. And say, oh, Mom, you're always traveling. And I always tell them, since they are kids, I always tell them, but it's good I'm going, because, scarcity generates value. So when I go and I come back, you're going to appreciate me more. And then my 16-year-old look at me and say, oh, you have not read Callie's latest book, because if you had, you would know that scarcity generates conflict. And you should abandon this capitalist view of our relations, Mom. I was like, okay. So that's what gets to educate your kids in an ecological perspective. So then after that, I actually had to read the book, not only because to be here today and to see what's there, also to be able to talk to my daughter. So there are many things I like about the book. And I think when reading it, I was thinking it comes at a moment where we are kind of like redefining many of the concepts that we have out there. There is all this new idea of what's well-being, right? Well-being has been defined in economic terms, no? The development, what's development and how do we place ourselves? So now well-being, it's been redefined. It's not what it used to be, or we start thinking in a different way of how we used to think of well-being. So in this book, I like that there is this redefinition of what's a limit or what is freedom. No, I think at some point you say that freedom is the power to limit our self-destructive pursuit of more, right? So you define, is a redefinition of freedom, not as this view that we have of now you can do everything, but now it's like I have the freedom to restrain myself, no? So it's kind of like, I really appreciate this, and I think it fits well with like this this movement, in more general movement on okay, we want to change the way we live, but it means that we have to redefine deeply some of the things that we, or how we conceive what's scarcity, or what scarcity takes out, or what's freedom, or what's well-being. So in the book there is all this redefinition of limits, and by consequence of how we understand freedom. The other thing I really like of the book, this is more like in the way it's written, no, is, as you say, no, it's not written for economists, so there are a lot of all these Greek connections and all this science fiction, and it's really like, this is, he didn't pay me to say that, but it's really enjoyable as a reading, not like a academic reading that you have to concentrate. You can read it. It reads easily, no? But the other, going back to the content, the other thing that I thought was very interesting on this idea of limits is that this idea that you have also explained here today of limits as a relation, right? And I think it also goes well with some of the things we are or scientists or other people are starting to think. We have here Kai Chang, who has started to talk about in the IPBS and in some of the reports. They are, like yesterday he was giving this talk about how we think of values, or the values of nature have been thought as an intrinsic and intrinsic. And in the last, I don't know, 5 or 6, 7 years, they have started to think, okay, we can also look at values as a relational, right? So things are not what they are in itself, but they are also independent on how you relate to them, or how the relations that are established is with that, no? And this idea that you were not able to convince Eric, no? That the limit is not the limit in itself, but it comes with a relation. So I think that's also like a powerful argument that it's starting to develop. And maybe we have things to learn in there from people who are doing social network analysis or physics, or who have been thinking more about entities, not about the entities in isolation, but how about, or even groups, no? How groups are more than the individuals, no? Groups are forms of relations, right? Now, a problem that this takes, and I'll talk a little bit more on that later, is that if limits are relational, what does it mean? That you have to set the limit yourself. You cannot set the limit yourself because you are in a relation. So who sets the limits has to be seen in the framework of limits as a relational. But before I get to that, just to also emphasize the other thing I really like about this, the definition, or what you propose about this idea of limits, is that you base it in this moral value, right? And I guess this was your argument that you were describing with Eric's, right? Limits, okay, they can be physical, but you don't base them in the physics. You base them in a moral quality, no? Like, limits is something that you should limit yourself where you leave the space for the others to do, right? So that's a moral value. I mean, you cannot do it, because if you do it, then you are stepping on someone else's rights, no? So the limit, it's physical. I mean, there are physical limits, but that's not what you are interested at, no? You are interested more in the moral quality. I can kill someone. I mean, physically I can do it. But it's a moral imperative that you don't do it, no? So you base it more in this idea of, like, what's the morality that we put, no? And you frame it in terms of the social solidarity and this idea of abundance, no? Believing in abundance to actually limit yourself, no? So yeah, I mean, these are things I really like and appreciated in the book. But then I also had some, well, I had some two main concerns, and then two things that I kind of like missed a little bit. But it's not a critique. It's just like when I was reading it, it resonated with me a lot with some literature in psychology and in neuroscience about psychology and development psychology, and how there is all this. I read recently a book that by a psychologist that it's called Sebastian Bocher, that it's called Le Bag Humain, no, the human bag, no. And he was arguing the same. He was arguing how we are, in our animal part of our brains, right? We are programmed for this immediate satisfaction, no, on sex and drugs, and we are programmed. That's what he was claiming, right? And this is because we are now observing all these, like, I don't know, addictions to telephone or obesity, or no, because we cannot control ourselves. And then he had like this kind of like claim, also like you, is like only by educating our rational part of the brain, we could win the irrationality in us that will push us to go without limits, because we want this kind of like satisfaction. So I thought there was kind of like a connection there that it can be done on how, like, the fact that we go without limits, you think it's cultural, and I think part of it is cultural, but it's also it can also have like some part of how our brain is constructed, and probably we need to understand a little bit more on that. And I mean, and I don't know, but maybe I was just thinking, maybe you want to look a little bit more on the literature on psychology and also on development psychology, how you educate kids, because there is like all this literature on whether you put, and maybe you're going to start reading this literature soon after the twins are here, about how kids that grow with limits are actually performing later better in life because you are able to operate in a space that, so there is a lot of literature on development psychology, and I don't know, I thought that was maybe a way where you want to expand that. But my two concerns, going back to the more economic or philosophical part of the book, one is in this idea of who sets the limits, and the other is on the limits to what. So on the one, on the limits to what, you say, okay, in 19,000, he say, if I have a finite piano, I can play infinite music. So there is a limitless part of what he wants. He wants to play infinite music, right? But the material part of it is limited. So maybe there is like, in thinking of that, maybe we can satisfy our desire for infinitive something on things that are immaterial. You can have infinity music, or you see what I mean? Yeah. And you didn't actually, you just assume that, you just don't discuss limit to what. Like if every action of every human action actually had consequences, and in that frame you also keep it into the material world, right? Can we aspire to have some illimited love, or illimited music, or illimited learning, right? Yeah. If these are things that don't, or not, should we try to moderate or to kind of like, should we aspire to have limits, moral limits on everything, because that's, only enjoy 100 books in your life, or I don't know. So the issue of the, or the concern on limits to what, I don't think you address it, or it's just not there. And maybe it's worth to think. For example, I was thinking also of that when you say, when you were talking about other societies, in some of these societies in the Pacific, probably not anymore, but the traditional Malinowski and the exchange of gifts, people will give all their wealth. They will do this gift exchange, right? So you will give your material wealth to the others, but you will gain in exchange status, right? So can we aspire to have illimited status by giving away your wealth, right? So I don't know. I'm just saying, okay, maybe you can. The limits to what? Maybe there are things that. So that was one of the things, and the other has to do with this issue I mentioned before about who sets the limits, right? In the examples that you give in the book, all the societies that have these limits, or you say, yeah, the Greeks have limits, and some but they are limits. Okay, God or the king set the limits of what you can do, or society can set the limit, or it's the person who should set. Every individual should set the limit, And then there, from my training in anthropology and understanding that humans is a cultural species, right? And we just learn. We just are social learners, and we just reproduce what the society around you does, and right. So trying to set limits on your own, it seems to me like a not very, something that is not going to go very far unless you have a group in which this is actually accepted, and there is a culture of limits. So this idea of, I mean, I don't know. I thought it was not very clear to me that this who sets the limits, of course, impose. You discussed at the beginning of the book that imposed limits are not good, because as soon as you prohibit people to actually do something, that's what you want to do. No, that's limits from outside are not good. I, as an anthropologist, I wouldn't try limits on the self, like having you just setting your limits is probably not what will make it. And then I thought that maybe you could have developed more this idea of limits by the commons, no? And you mentioned at some point how the commons, which is like a group with whom you share relations and with whom you develop rules, some of the limits that you mentioned are in groups that seems to function as commons, right? But you didn't actually develop this idea. You just developed the idea of like external limits, someone, the king, God, or the prophet, someone is telling you what's good and what's bad, versus me as an individual, which has a problem because I can set my limit in a place that steps onto what you don't like, right? So leaving the individual alone to set limits seems to me very, probably not very wise. But if you have the group, the commons, right, who together decide to set the, of course, this is easy in thinking of a small group. When you think in a planetary scale, it's really not, I mean, it's philosophically might be okay. In practice, I'm not sure it could work, no? But it was, for me, it was a little bit missing this part of like, and I thought, I mean, there is room there to think a little bit more on whom, on this idea of who sets the limits, the free riders of like, where is, if I put my limit, but overall, I think I enjoyed. I think I recommend everyone. This is what you want me to say.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you very much.
Yeah.
4 o'clock. I mean, those of you who want, you can go or stay until 4:30 and have a discussion with the rest if you want to ask something. I'm going to respond to what Vicky said, but I can do it also if I'm triggered also by other questions that might be on the same direction. So feel free to comment without having read the book, please. Yes, here.
What I understood from Malthus is that he said that it's difficult to stop population. Yeah. What I understood from Malthus is that he realized that it was difficult to stop population growth, but he also made kind of a moral claim that people should try to restrain sexually to have many kids. Am I wrong there?
No.
He said something like that, not? So
No.
He didn't say that at all because I think
that's a misunderstanding, but he hasn't.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting because actually he didn't say it, and then people start telling him in the first edition, "Oh, you missed birth control. You know, why didn't you say birth control?" And then suddenly, in the 5th edition of the book, he says, "I am against birth control because if we promote birth control, then we're going to remove a necessary stimulus for industry." So no one has tried to explain what it is. I think I explained what he means there because I've created a different framework of explaining what he means. So what he meant is that, okay, if people start controlling themselves and how many children they have, then you're not going to have this juncture between population and resources, and then they're not going to have a stimulus to work, which is, I think then it makes sense what Malthus said. And it makes sense because many people have said, why wouldn't Malthus support birth control? They said maybe because he was priest. But it wasn't because he was priest. It wasn't, I think, because it didn't fit with his political economic logic. And then the other thing which is strange with Malthus is that he didn't, unlike what we learn in ecological economics, he didn't agree with Ricardo that there are diminishing returns in agriculture, which is like, what? Malthus didn't believe that. And Harding, you know, the primary neo-Malthusian, writing at some point in his book, I don't understand why Malthus, maybe he didn't think it very well, but and actually no, because Malthus, in his argument, he does argue that food production can grow and has to grow in order to meet.
Look how much food production grew in his time, after his time.
No, he was right.
It was quite right. I mean, 2 centuries later, there was still growth in food production and productivity. But another thing that links a bit to what Vicky says is the self-restraint. I think if you look at reality, why do we have so many laws and obligations and prohibitions, even in UAB? When we submit something to the administration, it's always incorrect, and someone will correct us. If we wouldn't have those corrections, according to the bureaucracy, life would become a chaos for us. It would be ideal, probably, but I think that that's the result of the fact that people don't have self-restraint. They say, for instance, talking a bit also about little children, that if you don't correct your child every 10 seconds, then you're not a good parent when it's very small. But when it's a very small kid, the kid will do it a bit exaggerated, but people who let their children in a lot of freedom, these kids often will have problems. So I think economists are often criticized, but I think economists have a model that's quite consistent with psychology and evolution, that people are largely selfish. They are less selfish maybe in small groups. They're also socially sensitive, but they're largely selfish. And in that world, people will go for quick gratification and will not easily impose limits on themselves. And that's also why I think you call it romanticism, this idea that people put strong limits on themselves, is very romantic. And there's of course more complications that we know of now also, that at the time of Malthus maybe was not known, but the idea that there are systemic effects. For instance, if someone is restraining him or herself, and others will benefit from that. That's the free riding. We also know now that there are psychological spillovers. So people that restrain themselves in one area of life, they feel morally free to do worse things in other areas. And then there's the whole area of rebound. Where people, for instance, you hear it now during this week on television, it shocks me. We have to voluntarily restrain our energy consumption. If we do that with the same income, we will just spend our income on other energy consuming goods and services. So that's not going to be a solution. So self-restraint might have a good intention, but it's unlikely to work, I think. The self-restraint that we probably need is a self-restraint on the governmental level. That's why we have the government, and the government has become more and more dominant in our lives, for good or for bad, but understandably, to restrain ourselves. And the interesting thing in my view is that we choose that government as individuals, but kind of with our citizen behavior. As a citizen, I can say, I want to pay taxes if I know everybody pays taxes. But if you would say to me, pay voluntarily taxes, I would have a hard time, because I would expect few people to pay, and why would I then pay? And it's the same problem as with climate change. I mean, I could reduce my emissions to very low level, but if nobody else does it, then I sacrifice a lot, and you don't see the effect of that. That's exactly the reason why people free ride, and that's a bit missing in your story, I feel.
No, this I think I have to explain. I think what is not doing me good service is that the term self-limitation makes it think that it's about yourself, so it makes it seem personal. And then the example of the pianist, which I start, and it's an individual playing the piano, also makes it seem that I'm talking about the personal. But I try to say it in the book, but obviously it doesn't come out so clearly, that I'm not talking about the personal, I'm talking about the collective self-limitation.
No, you do say that, but you don't elaborate on it.
I don't elaborate, and the commons thing, I go very quickly on that, you know. But I do believe that personal self-limitation is possible within a system of collective self-limitation, and the system of collective self-limitation needs an ethic of personal self-limitation. Otherwise, you just have a tyrant that you want to rebel against. So I think the two go together, and this is what the chapter on Greece helped me do, because Greece has a snapshot. We don't know how this happened, okay? And perhaps a little bit of an idealized snapshot. But the snapshot was that in Greece, you had a democracy where people were deciding together. It was a society that limitation, like regulation, law, was like what people were spending like half of their day debating about. No? What law are we going to do here? Who is going to be punished, etc. So it was a society obsessed with self-limitation. And at the same time, we know, or I know from the work of Foucault on the history of sexuality, he has a whole book on the ethics of Greeks about sexuality, but talks about their selves in general. And there Foucault shows you how their whole personal ethic also, which is very different from ours, was also about thinking of the art of moderating themselves. So like it was like how many times do I have the sexual act, or how often do I eat, or how often do I exercise? But the idea was not so that I live longer, or so that I have more sexual partners, or that I am the most successful in my society. No, the idea was the ethic so that I live a moderate life that it's in line with our culture. So you see there a direct correspondence between the collective and the personal, no? If I move in our times, it's the opposite, because it's the opposite, but again mirror image, because both the collective, there is the idea of expansion and growth, and no, we can do it without limiting ourselves, really, just by improving the technologies, it's going to be sorted out. So that's at the collective level, and then at the personal level, it's like, you're not going to tell me what I'm going to do, get the government out of the way, I'm going to live the way I want. So basically what I'm making is a philosophical case or a plea for, but I don't know how we move from that to the other, but I think the other also is going to be the two, because also if your mind is about how do I selfishly maximize that, how do I free ride, then what type of government are you going to have? No, you're not going to have a government that is going to go against you and is going to try to regulate you and control you. Either you're going to rebel against that.
We have solved problems like taxation. Taxation has gradually evolved.
But taxation,
we pay all taxes, which is quite surprising.
Yeah.
That we have managed to impose tax systems on ourselves, even progressive tax systems.
Yeah, but the strong taxation, for example, came also in a period where there was a much stronger ethic of civic duty, of civic limitation. I would think this way. And actually, it has been reducing the last 20, 30 years, where the ethic also is the opposite. It's like, you're not going to tell me what I have to do, you can't tell me, etc. No? Anyway, let's hear also from others. Sorry. Yes.
Scarcity, of how we live in scarcity, and the idea of what the opposite would be. So you talk about enoughness. Enoughness would mean that we have no fear of the future, right? So I think like a basic problem with our society is fear. Even millionaires are in fear of losing their millions.
Yeah.
So this would be like a huge step to go away from fear, but the necessary step if we want to not live in scarcity anymore.
Yeah, 100%. I fully agree. And I write that in the book, that this ethic is reproduced by the system to everyone. So even if you're super rich, in the current society, you're not safe, because you're indebted at the same time, super indebted. So at any moment, you can collapse, no? Even the most powerful person, Trump, can collapse, right? Because he's also indebted, he has problems with so no one is like really safe here. So everyone has to run faster and faster. So exactly, how do you make institutions where people can feel trust in the environments, which is the word that people are using for a very different setup of societies, no egalitarian hunter-gatherer societies, but I think it works. Trust in your social environment, trust in your environment. I think the metaphor of the commons there works well. But how do you make this transition? Of course, then we get into the specifics, which was out of that.
If people who need to limit themselves, or communities that need to limit themselves, don't suffer the consequences of going beyond their limits, so if they don't actually suffer from their transgression, how do, for example, if you, in a globalized world where I have no idea what my MacBook or my iPhone actually, like the suffering that it causes, if I have no way of seeing that directly, experiencing it, how do we expect our communities and individuals, right, you need heteronomy and autonomy working together in coevolution. How do we move forward and actually encourage that self-limitation when you never, or at least personally, I don't think that I've been able to directly feel the suffering that some of my choices make. So how do we allow people to change if they never feel the suffering from the limits?
You can also jump if you want to say that. No, if you want to say, you can. No, I would say, it's a challenge of the commons at higher levels, so regulation at higher levels, so that your decision starts having a cost or an impact that you start experiencing, it starts coming to you, So if you have a global climate agreement and then your carbon activity starts translating into your everyday life, then it comes. But this requires self-limitation at higher levels. But I think what I'm also arguing in the book is that part of the problem is that if you keep saying it like, okay, as long as I can do it, I'm going to keep doing it, we begin on the wrong foot again, you know. This is what makes also climate agreements super difficult, starting from individuals who just want to externalize the cost, companies that want to externalize the cost, countries who want. So like, unless this also changes and you say, you know what, I can live well within the boat, you know. If you have more and more people who live okay within the boat, then it's easier also to have a climate agreement where we agree everyone to live okay within the boats. But if everyone wants to go out of the boat,
yeah. If going back to anthropology, no, and I mean, I don't know if that helps, but there are, I mean, in anthropology, we'll say that we humans learn, I mean, what we do is social learning, right? If a baby is born and you abandon him or her, will never get to anything, I mean, will just die, contrary to many other animals, right? So we can only progress as individuals if we have a society to support us, right? And our brain and I mean, we are programmed to learn from others. That's what makes our species different than others, right? And there are two ways that we learn. There are two ways. One is, they call it conformist bias, and the other is prestige bias. So you actually, we as humans, we do what most of other people do, or what people with a lot of status do. So, and this goes back to what you were just saying, and what Jerome was saying, no? Unless everyone else is reducing, like when everyone else is reducing, I'm also going to reduce. It's kind of like a conformist bias. That's what we say. No, everyone is doing it, I'll do it because probably this is the good thing. And the other bias is on this status bias. If Donald Trump, like the most prestigious person on earth, no, I mean, not Donald Trump, no, but like if people to whom you assign prestige, right, start having doing actions, right? And this is why this is what people buy things that influencers were. What's influencer? It's no one. It's just like someone who you assign some kind of prestige, or which is probably not based in an image, or I don't know what, no? But then everyone buys what this person buys, no? Or like if Jerome tells you, read that book, you will read it because you assign him some prestige and some kind of like, so there are two ways that can, like from anthropologists, you will say there are two ways that can take us out of this, no? When you have a big actor joining the cause, or when you grow the majority is joining the chaos, then you can create this culture of what you were saying of the Greek culture of like many doing. You need the culture telling you that this is good, and then you also join into that. No, I know it's not a solution to the problem, but it's kind of like some kind of like thinking of strategic ways in which, because we actually as a species, we just do what the others do and what the prestigious do. So this is probably ways in which we can influence.
Mm-hmm.
The language, I think in the language of common pool resources, the term is coordination more than conformism. So we need to create a coordination game. We need to make sure that now where everybody looks at their own interest, that people speak and know that the others are going to do also an effort.
Right.
And in modern policy language, you would say we need to harmonize the policies. And that's exactly, for instance, what Paris didn't do. The Paris Agreement just triggered the free riding because it didn't harmonize, it didn't coordinate. And for that reason, it's not really an agreement. It didn't solve the problem.
So I imagine part of the reason you wrote the book is because everyone's calling you Malthusian. You want to argue that you're not. And now if someone calls you Malthusian, you can say, I don't know, I wrote a book, I'm not a Malthusian. But some other people in the room might get called Malthusians, and we didn't write a book about it. How do we respond that degrowth, say, isn't Malthusian in just a couple sentences?
Because it wants to limit growth, it's not worried that there are limits to growth and they are coming. Because, okay, as someone who's concerned about limits to growth, I'm worried that we are destroying the climate, that we are screwing biodiversity, that we are making more and more ugly the Spanish coast. So I want that to limit that. So we want to limit that. I would like us to limit that, which is what we think as environmentalists. And I ascribe that, for example, to Carson's Silent Spring. So Silent Spring was about limiting that, right? So that's one way of thinking. The other way of thinking is we are running out of stuff. There are limits to growth. Metals are going to run out. Oil is going to run out. The climate is going to start impacting the economy, and then you're not going to have 3% growth. You know, it's like, so I'm saying let's escape that logic, because once you go into this second logic, then of course you are caught in this eternal debate of should we limit? Are there limits? Are there not limits? Are you a pessimist? Are you an optimist? You know, I'm saying, like, forget all that and accept that we want to limit growth. We don't like the Spanish coast the way it's becoming. You know, it's ugly, it's terrible, it's unequal. It is what it is. You know, so we want to limit that, and that's not Malthusian. Malthus didn't want to limit anything. Let's put it this way. Malthus didn't want birth control, so he didn't want to limit people. And he didn't think that we should limit how much food we are producing or how much metals we take out of the earth. And he didn't even think there were any limits to them. So we're not Malthusians in this sense.
Malthus wanted to limit the poor, you might say.
Malthus wanted to limit the poor, okay.
Well.
And this also we don't want to limit the poor. So also. Malthus, yes. Malthus didn't exactly want to limit this. I didn't say, for those of you who haven't read Malthus. So Malthus' main concern was to justify why there are poor, and basically to prove, that's what he said his book was about, is to prove that a classless society that the French Revolution was promising was impossible. So he basically wrote the book as that. He didn't write it about population or about the resources. That was not the debate at the time. The debate was, can the French Revolution happen in England and create a classless society in England? So basically what he was trying to prove with his book is that no matter what you do, and even if you start from a perfectly classless society, inevitably you're going to end up with having some very rich people and some very poor. And these poor people, we don't have to help them, because if we help them, we make matters worse for them and for everyone. That was his argument. So then he argued that, okay, they are poor because there's not enough for everyone, and there's not enough for everyone because we want to have as many children as possible. That was his argument. That was part of his argument. And the other argument was like, don't help them, because if you help them, they're not going to work hard enough, and then you're not going to produce enough to feed everyone. So keep them poor so that they keep working like crazy, and then we produce enough food for them and their children. That was more or less Malthus' argument. This has nothing to do with degrowth. We're not saying anything remotely close to that. The planetary boundaries. I had something bad to say, and then I regretted, because Rockstrom said, yeah, degrowth, maybe we need it. So I said, maybe I was too rushed there. Yeah, no, planetary boundaries, I think it's good as long as we avoid this discourse that these are boundaries, that they are set there. Some scientists have discovered us, and they tell us that up to there you can go and no further than that. You know, depends how we set them. It's like the 2 degrees Celsius or the 1.5 degrees Celsius. If we say that, okay, that's as far as we can go given our uncertainty, given our collective discussions, given the uncertain science, and that's what we want to do, that's what we want to do, that's where we want to limit ourselves to 1.5 degrees, I'm all for that. I don't have any objection. Where I have an objection is when it starts being presented that these boundaries, that they bound us, and we have to stay within them. So this discourse of planetary boundaries. I criticize planetary boundaries, and the other one that you're gonna like, ecological footprint. You know, we're using 2 Earths every year. It's like, okay, we've been using 2-3 Earths every year since April, and we're still around. You know, so what's this discourse that we? So I'm saying that this way of thinking about it as a limited Earth, that it's scarce, that it's limited, and we are always in excess of it, I find it problematic. And at the very least, we can say it hasn't worked. It hasn't made us think differently. And to the extent that it has, our elites now start thinking, if you read the tech leaders, etc., they're thinking about colonizing other planets. So if you tell them our ecological footprint is going there, it's minor, but it's going to go a lot of money there, Jeroen. I was reading about Jeff Bezos. He's like the richest person on Earth, and now where he puts the majority of his money is not on developing climate mitigation technologies, but on colonizing the Mars, because the moon first and then the Mars. So that's his imagination. Let him go, but he burns a lot of money on the way there, no? Yeah, I'm all for sending them there. But.
All the rich guys can
Okay, last one I think we're going to take, yeah. Okay, let's take two together and then we finish, yes.
There's an article in the Dicta that popped up when you were in the web that talks about how people like that working that are concerned in environmental issues and people that work at Dicta, it's me.
It's my article.
Because they think individual actions don't make a difference, so it doesn't have reasons. And well, for me, individual actions would be about what you say. I can live without eating meat, and I can live without buying that much clothes and buying in certain places. So, what do you think about this article?
I was going to say, like, similar to degrowth and this argument, do you think it would be effective for the climate movement to go more with this kind of argument as opposed to the Greta Thunberg scientists and individual improvement of consumers in a slightly different way? Do you think that, which do you think is more effective?
No, I don't see my argument as being different from Thunberg's, you know. So I'm not. Why would you see it as different? Because I'm struggling to say that it's not different. I'm saying we are destroying the climate and we should stop, you know. So I don't have an objection to that. And with climate change, it doesn't work so much, my example, but it works much more with the standard limits to growth argument that we make about peak oil, materials, etc. You know. So what I'm saying is, like, let's take the emphasis from we are running out of things and put it we are destroying things. That's all I'm saying. I don't think Thunberg's debate is very much about we are running out of things. There is a little bit of the catastrophism that it has to be treaded carefully, I think. Because I think catastrophism provokes different reactions. But I think to the extent that I've followed her, she balances it okay. I'm not critical of
The
her.
argument of setting limits and talking about degrowth, sometimes even talking about anti-capitalism is seen as something which will not appeal, and therefore we don't need to talk about. Although if you ask people in the movement, only 90% of them are okay with it. It's not something that is seen as an effective strategy, something that's how we should be presenting ourselves.
No, that's a broader question, but you have a point. This is to think about, and depends also on the specific social movement or moment. So I think, like, Greta Thunberg is having a great effect right now. I'm not the one who would say she should speak about the growth all the time if that was not going to help her. As long as what she says, I think I agree with what she's saying, and I think she's pushing in the right direction, perhaps. About the meat, I was one of the co-authors. It was a master's student from here who wrote it. But we just studied what people at ICTA think, so we did. That's what they think, so it wasn't like whether we agree or not. And this includes ourselves. So our what we found there was like, okay, you would ask people, because we interviewed only people at ICTA who eat meat. We didn't ask those who don't eat meat. So we interviewed people who eat meat, and we said, why do you eat meat? And there were like four categories, three. The two big ones was like, let's say, because it's capitalism, it's gonna change. Not me alone is not gonna change so much. It's systemic change. Then the second was like, because in the future we're gonna have technologies, it's not fix the problem. Like, that's how they were justifying themselves. The third was like, it's too complex. Will it really make a difference if I stop eating meat, given how complex the world is? And the fourth one was like, yeah, I eat meat. I wish I didn't, you know, but it's tasty. So there were like these four categories. We ended up with a Q analysis. This is what people who eat meat at ICTA do. Now, are they right or wrong? I agree with you that we would say, okay, you could change yourself and think that the system will change also while you change yourself. But many people were giving this justification. Okay, thanks everyone for coming and staying until the very end. Okay.